Good morning. We have another remote edition as I travel the Atlantic region yet again for a wedding. And welcome to everybody. Thank you so much for doing this online. We're going to be returning to a full regular schedule this week. So this Daf Yomi 8 to 9, and then all week long, 8:30 to 9:30 in Mir Hashem. I don't think I have any special crazy meetings this week. I have to double check myself, right? Is that correct? I think we're good. Then we'll start to
Perfect.
catch up a little bit. We are at the Mishnah. Second Mishnah on Daf Chaf Hey Amud Beis. Last Mishnah we had discussed quickly through. We had talked about small nuts and large nuts, and we were doing our comparison Mishnayos that there was a distinction between the nuts that start off sweet and then they become bitter as they get more ripe, and then the ones that start off bitter and they get more sweet. And we had discussed that one opinion was that whenever they are sweet, that's when they're chayav in truma, and so therefore those two have a contrasting halacha. But then we had another opinion that said zevazeh poter and zevazeh chayev, which means that either one holds that when they are both small, they are exempt, and only the one that becomes sweet as it gets bigger becomes chayev and truma. The other one stays poter because it's bitter as it gets bigger. And then we had the other one that holds that no, when they're small, they're both potentially they're not obligated, but they both become obligated, one because it's edible and one because they are ripe. So the subtle change in our Mishnayos is going from contrasting two things that are different and distinct to contrasting the same item within its lifespan and how the halacha changes within its lifespan. And so the last couple of Mishnayos are going to follow that pattern as we finish off the last, well, three or four Mishnayos that we're going to finish off today in ending the parak. The first one is hatemed, which is a wine-like mixture. They would take sediment from wine and they would mix it with water, and then it would hopefully ferment, and then it would become a wine beverage. So a temed, anshlo hechmitz, if you've got this temed, which is this mixture of sediment and water, before it ferments, eino nikach bekesef meiser, so it has the halachos of water. And that means that when you have your meiser, the 10% that you're going to take off your crops, that you're going to bring to Yerushalayim and you're going to eat in Yerushalayim, you can't buy water with that, right? So water is not considered to be one of the chashuv foods that you can buy with your Meiser Sheni money. So this temed, which has not yet fermented, is still water, and therefore you cannot buy your Meiser money when you get to Yerushalayim. You cannot use Meiser money to buy it. Uposel es hamikvah. The other thing that makes it water is if you have a mikvah, you need 40 sa'ah of water. If you're missing 40 sa'ah of water, then this in the slightest amount, if you put 3 lug of non-kosher mikvah water, what makes mikvah water kosher and acceptable? It has to be either stream water or it has to be from rainwater. It cannot be drawn water, right? You can't scoop it up in a container and now you've got it in your pail. Now it's drawn water and pour that in. That's invalid for a mikvah. If you had a mikvah that was not yet kosher and you poured 3 lug of drawn water into that mikvah, all of the water in that mikvah now become invalidated. So this temed that is not the halacha when it comes to other types of liquid. If you poured wine into it, that wouldn't invalidate it. Yeah, Yehuda.
When when you filter the water, doesn't the filter like pick it up and replace it back down
A
again? Could
good
that be a
question,
problem?
and I'm not an expert on the mikvah filtration systems. So that we would have to have some sort of a filtration system where the water would flow through, because you can have waters flow through things, right? If it's pumped up into a container and then poured back down, maybe that would be a concern. So I'm sure that the ones who create mikvahs and design those filtration systems have to have that in mind. But yeah, it's a fair question, and I know that they usually have some kind of switch. They don't like the mikvah run. You don't like your filters running while the mikvah is going. I don't know that it has to do with this issue, right? That this issue, if once drawn, then the water is not invalid. Although I would say that potentially the other way that they work around it, and maybe I'll do a little research and see if I can post something about it, is that we're going to see that once mikvah water is not valid, you can revalidate the mikvah water by making the mikvah water touch the other mikvah water that is not valid. right? So if you have drawn, well, that's what we do in our modern mikvahs. We fill up the tank, right? We fill up the tank with 40 saw of rainwater, and then you have another drawn water, right? Which you can have, and then you touch the two together, and now the whole thing becomes a kosher mikvah. Once you have 40 saw of water and your mikvah is valid, then you can touch other water to it and make it all valid, and that's okay. This is talking about a circumstance where you don't yet have a kosher mikvah. So I should make that distinction. It probably could be, Yehuda, that you're right, that that's what's going on there in the filter. But once it gets put back down again, it touches the mikvah and it's acceptable and fine. But that's what's going on here. So this is a mikvah that's not yet kosher, and so therefore, if it's water, then it's going to invalidate the mikvah. Misha hechmitz, once the temed ferments, so then nikach bekesef meiser. Now, in its life cycle, it changes, and the halacha is the reverse, right? You're allowed to purchase it with meiser money because it's a fermented alcoholic beverage. Veno posel es mikvah, and now it's not water anymore. So if it falls into the mikvah, it does not invalidate a mikvah. Ha'achin hashutfin. You can have brothers that are partners. Now, there's two ways for brothers to become partners in a state of their father. If their father passes away and he leaves the estate to two brothers, so then the estate remains intact. The brothers are co-owners of that estate. So in that circumstance, keshachayavim bekalbon peturin mimaiser behema keshachayavim mimaiser behema peturin minakalbon. So I should mention the second way for them to become partners. The second way for them to become partners is they divide up the estate. And now this brother owns this part, this brother owns this part. Then they get together and they say, you know what we should do? We should become partners because the estate doesn't function as efficiently as two separate entities. Let's be partners again. When they realign each other as partners, now they're business partners like anybody else are business partners. There's a distinction between being partners in an estate and being joint business partners. Being partners in the estate means that you are co-owners of a single entity. Whereas partners is that you are both co-owning the partnership together. And it has practical halachic differences. In the circumstance when you are two partners on a single entity, so difference number one is meiser behema. The Torah tells us that the 10th animal of our flock has to be donated as a korban. However, the Torah also tells us that if an animal is co-owned by two people, so then it does not have to be brought. There's no tithing of those animals. The 10th animal does not go to a korban. So if you've got brothers who are partners, co-partners in a single estate, the estate really is the owner. It's a single owner. And therefore, all of the flock has to get tithed. However, if the flock had gotten divided amongst the brothers, and then the brothers said, hey, you know what? Let's combine together and we'll share the flock. Now they're a business partnership like anybody else, and they're not obligated in Meiser Behemos. Similarly, we have the halacha of a kalbon. Now here Rashi explains kalbon. We had kalbon before once, and we had discussed it in one way. Rashi here brings it a different way. The explanation of the kalbon is that when the half shekel is being brought, everybody has to contribute every year a half shekel. The Chazal instituted that there's an additional amount, small amount, that one has to add on to your half shekel. What the reason for that is, Rashi says here, is that the coin itself may lose some value because the metal on the coin scrapes away, right? A half a shekel of silver was literally a half a shekel of silver. So if you had a half a shekel of silver and it was a worn out coin, so then it would contain less than half a shekel of value. So Chazal said, add on a little bit of a kalbon in order to be able to make sure that that is valid. Now, that requirement, the other thing that we had, the other time we had mentioned this kalbon is potentially if two people are getting together and they are donating a kalbon, they're both donating a half shekel together, so they give 1 shekel. So there's a fee that you have to pay the money changer in order to divide it into 2 half shekels. That could be the reason for the kalbon as well. But going in the first reasoning, right? If a person, an individual, pays on behalf of themselves, they have to bring a kalbon. But if a person brings on behalf of somebody else, they don't have to bring a kalbon because they're not, we're not concerned that the people are going to sort of cheat and bring their cheapest coin. If you're bringing it for yourself, you might. If you're bringing it for somebody else, probably not. So there's no need for the kalbon if you're bringing it on behalf of somebody else. Therefore, if you have two partners together, then the requirement is that they have to bring the kalbon. right? If they're dividing if they divide it up, right, and then they already divided up, and now they're combining into a what do you call it, a partnership together. So then they're basically paying for each other's half shekel and paying for each other's half shekel. They're not obligated in the kalbon. But if they were bringing it from the father's estate, they're essentially bringing it on for themselves because the estate they represents them, and they are obligated in the kalbon. So in these two circumstances, we've got opposite laws depending on which type of partnership they have. Okay, says the Gemara. Money masnisen. Who's our Mishnah following? Which opinion is this? Lo Rabbi Yehuda velo Rabbanan. It doesn't seem to follow the Rabbi Yehuda's opinion or the Rabbanan's opinion. Detanya, we're in a brisa. Hamitamed v'nosan mayim b'mida umatza k'dei midaso. Right? If somebody is making temed, okay, so he poured the water into the sediment, and then he measures afterwards how much water does he have in this temed, how much liquid is here, and then he finds that the exact amount that he poured in is still the amount that's there. So putter. So according to the Chachamim, that indicates nothing has happened, right? If there was more liquid in here than when he started, that would mean that the juice has flown from the grape sediment into the liquid, and now he's got some kind of new mixture here. But if he poured in 5 cups of water, now he's got 5 cups of temed, then whatever he poured in is what he's got here, and so therefore it's exempt, right? It's not chayav in meiser, right? Because if it's wine is obligated. You have to bring meiser for it. If it's just water doesn't have meiser. So if it's water, that's another distinction between temed and meiser. And temed and mayim, temed and water is wine and water is that wine is obligated in meiser and water is not. So if this temed has the exact same volume of water as when you started, it's still water, according to the Chachamim. Rabbi Yehuda mechayev. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, that's not true. What's happened is water has gotten absorbed into the sediment, and then the sediment has flushed out new liquid. And so what you have here is, in fact, temed, and therefore it's in fact obligated in meiser. Now, money. Who's this? Now, what's going on here? Who's our Mishnah? Rabbanon, if our Mishnah is following the Rabbanon, afagav dehichmitz. So then what difference does it make? Our Mishnah seems to make the entire distinction of whether it's temed or not dependent on whether it has fermented. And this brisa that we just quoted seems to say that no, it's a matter of how much water there is. So if the water is the same amount, shouldn't we investigate to see if it has fermented, right? If it's fermented, then according to if it's the Rabbanon, right? So then even if it's fermented, so then the temed should be water, right? Because it's the same amount. And Rabbi Yehuda, if our Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda, afagav delo hechmitz. Even if it hasn't fermented, right, then it's considered wine, even if it has the same amount. Oh, Yehuda is out, coming back in. There we go. It's back. Okay. So Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rabbi bar Avua. So Rav Nachman answers. He's going to give us explanation of the Mishnah number 1 of 2. Amar Rabbi bar Avua. He says the name of Rav Avua on Chaf Vav and Aleph. Beshehechmitz machlokas. What's happened is our Mishnah. What's going on is the machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanon is after it has fermented, right? So our Mishnah says depends if it's fermented or not. Says the machlokas, even though it has fermented, of course it's fermented, right? If it was not fermented, then nobody would say that it's temed. But even once it has fermented, then there's an argument still between the Rabbanan and Rabbi Yehuda. The Rabbanan say if it has fermented and it's still the same volume, then it's still water. And Rabbi Yehuda is going to say that if it's fermented and it's the same volume, then it's temed. And therefore, Masnisin, our Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda. That's our Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda's opinion that says that even though it's the same volume, once it has fermented, it is considered to be temed. V'cheinam Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina. That's what Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina explained. Beshe hechmitz machlokas. Our argument between Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanon is when it has already fermented. V'amar Rav Nachman Amar Rabba. My text has a little missing letter here. Rav Nachman Amar Yehuda bar Avuha, right? Rav Nachman Bar Yehuda says, Temet shalachlu bekesef meiser ulevasof hechmitz. So what happens if, right? He says, what happens if I've got temed and somebody bought it with Meiser money? So our Mishnah said that if you bought it with Meiser money, so right, if it has not fermented yet, so then you can't use Meiser money to buy it because it's still water. What happens if he buys it and then 2 weeks later it is now fermented? So what happens when you bought it originally with the Meiser money? It was water. Now it's temed. What happens? So the answer is kana Meiser. It works. It's effective. And the Meiser money that you spent is no longer Meiser, right? So it's sorry, the temed, yeah, the temed becomes Meiser and the money is no longer Meiser. My time, why is that? When he purchased it, he took the money, the temed was unfermented, and that should make it water. And 2 weeks later, now it's fermented. Why? Because igloi milsa limafreya de perahu. This is a very interesting thing. It must be that if it's fermented now, that the process of fermentation already began. And even though it's water, it's watery, nevertheless, it is considered to be temed from the outset because it became fermented later on, right? So that's our indicator. So that means that on May 31st, he took his Meiser money and he bought this temed with it, and it was watery. It had not fermented yet. So we would have told him, don't buy it, right? 2 weeks, but he buys it anyway. 2 weeks later, it ferments. We say the sale of Meiser was valid on May 31st because even though it wasn't fermented at the time, it must have already started the fermentation process. Otherwise, it wouldn't be fermented 2 weeks later. Ella masnisin de katani hechmitz. So in lo hechmitz lo, but now you've got to explain our Mishnah. When our Mishnah says that if it fermented, yes, and if it didn't ferment, not, well, then even if it didn't ferment, it should be valid. It should be a valid sale anyway, because it's going to eventually ferment. Dilma ishavke hava machmitz. So we should say, well, 1 second. Why is it not valid? We should say, perhaps if he left it alone, then it would have fermented. And so therefore, let the sale be acceptable and valid. So how are we going to understand our Mishnah that says that if he bought the temed, it's not? So Amar Rabba explains, Keshishiyar menu bekos velo hichmitz. What happened is that the seller saved a cup of the temed and he put it on the side. And he waited 2 weeks. And then he checked the cup that he had, and that cup never fermented. As a result of finding out later on that it never fermented, now he knows that what he sold originally was really water. And so therefore the temed never became a valid sale, and the money remains. The money now he has in his possession is still Meiser Sheni money. So he basically did a test. He kept a sample. And then by investigating the sample, he knows definitely and for sure that what he sold is not fermented. But if he had sold it normally, he could presume that potentially most of the time we would rely on a rove scenario, and we would say it would have fermented and the sale would be valid. Okay, so that is explanation number one. Rava explains separately. Hamani, who is this opinion? Is Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. It's Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri's opinion. D'Tanan, we learn a Mishnah. This is a familiar Mishnah from Maseches Makos, for those who have done Maseches Makos. Gimel lugin mayim chaser kurtov. If I have 3 lug of water minus a little bit, right? A kurtov is 1/64 of a lug, very small amount. Shenafal litochan kurtov yayin, and a little drop that's missing in this 3 lug of water, a little drop of wine falls in. Umar ehen kamar yayin. Now that amount of wine is sufficient to color the entire mixture of 3 lug and make it reddish. So now you've got this reddish mixture of mostly water, but a drop of wine. V'naflu lemikvah. And now that falls into the mikvah. As we said, that you need your 40 saw of mikvah water, and you've got 3 saw missing. You've got 3 lug missing. Now you try to fill in your 3 lug with this mixture. If it was water, as we said, it would invalidate your whole mikvah. But since this is water colored with a drop of wine, so then it is now considered to be wine. And if it's wine that falls in the mikvah, it doesn't ruin the mikvah. So lo pasluhu. That's what we say. It does not invalidate that mikvah. Gimel lugin mayin chaser kurtov. If I have the same case, I've got 3 lug of water minus a drop. Shenafel letochan kurtov cholov, and now a drop of milk falls into it. Milk is white, and it's not going to color the water and make it red. Umarein kamari mayim. So therefore, the water is going to now look clear enough, and it's going to still look like water. V'naflu lemikvah. If that falls into the mikvah, lo pasluhu. It's not water. It's still a mixture of water and milk, because even though it looks like water, it's not. So therefore, according to this opinion, it's not going to invalidate your mikvah. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri Omer, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri disagrees. He says, Hakol holecha achar mare. Everything goes by what it looks like. If it looks like water, it is water. If it looks like wine, then it's wine. Therefore, if I've got 3 lug of this mixture and it's clear and it falls into the mikvah, it's going to invalidate the mikvah. So therefore, lav, so lav amar Rabbi Yochanan basar chazus azlinan. Now, Rabbi Yochanan saying that everything goes by what it looks like. So hachanami zil basar chazusa. So therefore, in our Mishnah, we're going to go and we're going to follow whether this is water or whether this is temed based on its appearance. The time of echazusa dahai maya ninhu. And so therefore, at the time that this is sold, he's going to disagree that even though eventually it will turn into temed and eventually it will ferment, our Mishnah is following Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri's opinion that says, I don't care what happens to it eventually, even though that is the general opinion, right? Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says, if I look at it right now and it looks like water, it is water. And therefore, it's not going to, the sale is invalid in our Mishnah simply because it follows Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri's opinion. Okay, and he's not universal. And upliga Rabbi Elazar, and he's gonna argue this whole thing is now Rav Nachman. Sorry, that's the next part. Rav Nachman's opinion is going to argue with Rabbi Elazar. Rav Nachman explained that our Mishnah is dealing with that our machlokas between Rabbanan and Rabbi Yehuda about whether temed is wine or not, if it's the same volume of water that you had when you started, is after it already fermented. And our Mishnah is following Rabbi Yehuda that if it's the same amount of water, once it has fermented, it is temed. And that's Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. That is the way we explained it first. That explanation conflicts with explanation number 2, Rabbi Elazar's opinion. Rabbi Elazar's opinion, Dama Rabbi Elazar says, Hakom modim she'ein mafrishin olav mimakom acher, ela imkein hechmitz. Rabbi Elazar is that he holds that if I have 2 different containers of temed, I've made 2 batches. So batch number 1 and 2 are independent in their fermentation. One might ferment and the other one might not. So says Rabbi Elazar, I can't take Meiser and Trumos from one barrel for both barrels, because it could very well be that this barrel won't ferment. And as a result, I'm going to be taking water as my Trumas and Meisters on behalf of temed, which is not, it's just wine. So therefore, I have to take separate. I have to Truma and Meiser from each barrel separately. That way I'm covered. Because if the barrel turns into water, it stays as water. So I took water for water. There's no Truma required anyway. It doesn't matter. But if it's wine, I definitely took wine for wine, and then it is valid. So kasavar below hechmitz machlokas. So he's saying that the argument between Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanon is before it ferments. He says even before it ferments, it's an argument. Rabbi Yehuda is going to say it's considered temed even before it has fermented, and the Rabbanon is going to say it is not considered. It's considered water before it ferments. V'ad kan lo mechayev Rabbi Yehuda ela minei ubei aval mi'alma lo. So that which Rabbi Yehuda is saying, Rabbi Yehuda is suggesting, Rabbi Yehuda doesn't require a separation of extra trumas and maestros, right? Except from the temed itself, right? But you can't take from other temed. You can't take from others, right? Even though Rabbi Yehuda is saying in this circumstance that this water you have to consider to be temed, he's saying, okay, but You got to take Trumas Meisers. But I'm not going to say it's guaranteed to become Temed. I don't know that. So you can't just take it, right? You can't just take Temed from another barrel in order to satisfy this one because Dilma Asi Lafruche Minachiyav Alapater. I might be taking from I might take from an exempt barrel that for Trumas Meisers on an obligated barrel. I'll take water out for a real Temed. So therefore, that is our Mishnah is going to be following the Rabbanan's point of view that they say that you have to wait till it ferments in order for it to be real temed. Before it ferments, then the Rabbanan say it's definitely water. Rabbi Yehuda says it might be temed. And if it's temed, you have to take out Trumas and Maestros. But then Rabbi Yehuda holds like Rabbi Elazar and says that if you're going to take out Trumas and Maestros, you got to make sure that you take out for each barrel separately. You can't take from one on the other because you have no idea what's going to happen next. Okay, so that's how we're going to explain it according to Rabbi Elazar. Okay, next. Tana Rabbanan, last line of Chavav Amud Aleph. Tana Rabbanan, rabbis learn Hatemed, back still talking about this temed mixture, Ad Shelo Hechmitz, before it ferments, Mashki B'mayim, so it can, it's considered water, right, before it ferments. And if it touches the water in a mikvah, so then it becomes valid for mikvah. As we said, by water, generally speaking, right, once the water is called mashika, if I take my 40 self water in this container and my water in this container and I touch the two together, then the entire thing becomes a mikvah, right? So if I've got my temed, before it ferments, if it touches the mikvah water, it becomes mikvah, and I can go to the mikvah in that temed water. Mi shehechmitz, however, once it ferments, now it's wine. Ein mashiko b'mayim, I cannot turn it into mikvah water because it's not water anymore, right? If I take wine and I touch it to a mikvah, it's still not a mikvah, right? It's got to be water. Amar Rava, so Rava says, Lo shanu ela shetimdu b'mayim tahorim v'nitmeu, aval tameim mikara lo. Rava says, well, let's make a distinction here, right? If we're trying to purify this temed, I have temed that became impure in some way, and I'm trying to purify it by touching it into the mikvah. So, because I can do that with water, I can't take any other liquid and dunk it in the mikvah and make it tahor. Just water. Water is the only liquid I can do that with because it can become mikvah water, so it can become tahor. So what's happened here? He says, what happens if I had water that was initially tahor, and now I mixed it with sediment, okay? Then it became tameh after that fact. That's when I can touch the two together and I can fix it. But if the water was tameh first, and then after the water was tameh, then I mixed it with the temed, with the sediments, I can't fix it after that, okay? Now, we're going to try to figure out why does it make any difference when the water became tameh, before or after it was mixed in. So, Azo Rav Geviha mi Beiksil. So, Rav Geviha from Beiksil, he came along and he said, Amra Lishmata Kamid Ravashi. He taught this teaching of Rava in front of Ravashi. Maishna Tamein Mikara Delo. Why is it that we said that if the water was tameh first and then you mix it together with the sediment, that wouldn't work? Because the amrinon, because what we're saying is, Aidi demaya yakiri shachne tatoi. We're saying the water is the more dense material, right? What happens is water sinks to the bottom and the fermented beverage rises to the top. So when you take your container and you submerge, I've got a mikvah. How am I purifying it? I'm taking my container, I'm submerging it into the mikvah, and then right when the top of the water rolls over into the container, that's when it touches. Well, if the water is denser on the bottom and the fermented beverage is thinner on the top, then what's the water touching? The water is touching fermented beverage and not water. That's why it doesn't work. So therefore, right, if it was tame first and I mix it together, then the water is going to sink to the bottom, and I'm going to have fermented beverage on the top. Uperi kapi el. So the fruit's going to float on top. Velo kasalkulu hashakulamaya. So therefore, the connection between the water in the mikvah and the water in the container is not going to touch because the fruit mixture is going to be on top. So ihachi, if that's the logic, tahurim ulavasof unami. So what if it was tahor first and you mixed it together and then it became tameh? Why would that make any difference? The water's still going to sink to the bottom. The fruit's still going to float to the top. So ella mibalbali. So there must be a confusion and a mix-up. Hachanami mibabali. This is confused and mixed up. The halacha is not like that. It does not matter. You cannot fix temed because the water's always going to sink to the bottom. There's no reason to if the water no, sorry, it says babli. It's mixed up, meaning the reason why it's valid is because the water and the temet is mixed up. So the water doesn't sink to the bottom. It's mixed in together. So therefore, if it's valid when the water was purified first, was impure first, then it's valid even if the water is impurified later. It makes no difference whether the water became became impure before it got mixed in with the temet or afterwards. It doesn't matter. It's going to be acceptable as long as it has not fermented once it gets dunked in the mikvah. Okay, that's enough temed. We are at the next Mishnah. Mishnah says, Kol makom sheish mecher ein knas. When we're dealing with young girls, we've got the following halachos, 3 stages of their lives in terms of physical maturity. They are minors, ktanos. They're ktanos, well, 4 stages really. From 0 to 3, they're ktanos. Then they are ktanos still until the age of 12 when they have 2 hairs. The difference between when they're 0 to 3 and when they're 3 and above is that we have a rule that any relations that one has with a child under 3 are not considered to be relations. That's invalid and unacceptable, and it's not considered to be relations of any sort. So if a girl has relations before she's 3, she's considered to have never had relations halakhically. From 3 until 12, the relations are relations, but she is a minor. Then she moves into the state of a nara for 6 months. After she has 2 hairs, she becomes a nara for 6 months. After being a nara for 6 months, she turns into a bogeres. A bogeres, a fully adult female. Okay, so those are the 3 stages. So kol makom sheyesh mecher ein knas. We have a halacha of a mecher. Mecher means that a father has the right to marry off his daughter. Call it a sale, because essentially the person is giving the kedushin, the money, to the father, and in exchange, the daughter is married. That is halacha that is valid only when she's a ketana, when she is a minor, right? Such a halacha does not exist when she becomes an adult. So, and then we have a rule of knas, right? We have a rule of knas, which is that if somebody assaults a girl or seduces a girl when she's a minor, then the fine goes to the father. There's a fine of 50 shekel that goes to the father. And when she's an adult, there's no fine that goes to the father. So the halacha is, right, a father can sell his minor daughter, can sell his minor daughter as a shifcha. I've said it to marriage, but we're talking about shifcha kananis, a shifcha ivris here, right? So he's selling his daughter into being a shifcha ivris, I should have said, right? So the shifcha ivris works like this. She becomes he can sell her, like we had talked about we haven't talked about it, but an Eved Ivri gets, if he steals, so that he can go into be sold himself into slavery to pay off the debt. It takes 6 years to pay it off. It doesn't quite work the same for a girl. A girl cannot be sold as an adult, but she can be sold as a minor. If the father sells her into slavery as a minor, so she can go free, either by finishing off 6 years of service, or by becoming 12 years old, by becoming a nara, or she can exit her slavery by marrying the master or his son. So if the girl is up until the age of being a nara, so then he can sell. Right, he can sell as a shifcha what do you call it? She's a shifcha ivris, right? I'm not sure I'm saying that right. She is a he can sell her as long as she is a minor, right? But she doesn't get a knas. He doesn't get a knas. The only time that a father gets a knas is if she is assaulted when she is a na'ara. That's during that 6 month period, because the Torah says that she's a na'ara ha'me'orasa. If she is assaulted while she's a na'ara, then there's a knas. So says the Mishnah, before she's a na'ara, she's a minor, so then the sale can be done. But once she becomes a na'ara, the father can no longer sell her, but that's when the knas rule kicks in. So those two things never overlap in the same person. One begins when the other ends. That's what our Mishnah is saying. Right? Kol makom sheyesh knas in mecher. If she's an old enough person for the father to get a knas, then the father cannot do a mecher, cannot do a sale. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Rav Yehuda says in Rav Zu Divrei Rabbi Meir. That's Rabbi Meir's shita, right? Only Rabbi Meir holds that way. Ava Chachamim Amru, the Chachamim disagree, and they say yesh knas b'makom mecher. There is an overlap between the two. They hold that a knas applies during the entire period that a girl is underage. So as long as she's a 12 from as long as she's a nara and below, she's a ketana or a nara, the father gets knas. So therefore, there is an overlap. There's a time when the father could both do a mecher, do a sale, and he can collect a knas. Detanya, as we learned in a brisa, ketana mibas yom echad ad shetavi beisaros. The brisa says, if she's a ketana when she is 1 day old until she becomes a nara and she becomes physically mature and has 2 hairs, yeshla mecher. The father is entitled by the Torah to allow the father to sell her as a shifcha. Ve'ein la knas, but she doesn't have knas. Father cannot collect a knas. Mishatavi beis saros. Once she gets 2 hairs, ad sheiti bager, until she becomes an adult. 6 months later, yesh la knas. Then the father can collect a knas. Ve'ein la mecher, but he can no longer sell her. Divrei Rabbi Meir. That's Rabbi Meir's opinion, and that's consistent with our Mishnah. Shahaya Rabbi Meir Omer, Rabbi Meir used to say, Kol makom sheyesh mecher ein knas, v'kol makom sheyesh knas ein mecher. The two don't overlap. Whenever you can do a mecher, there's no knas. Whenever you can do a knas, there's no mecher. The two don't overlap. When one begins, the other ends. The Chachamim Omer, but the Chachamim disagree. Ktana mibas gimel shonim v'yom echad. If you have a child who's 3 years old and above, and we said why 3? Because before that it's not bia, it's not considered relations. Once she's 3 years old and above, ad sheti bager, until she's 6 months past being a nara, yesh la knas. That's where the rule of knas kicks in, and the father gets a 50 shekel knas penalty from somebody who assaults the daughter. Knas in mecher lo. So that means there's a knas, but not a mecher. But that means that sounds like there's a knas, but not a mecher, right? But that shouldn't be true because he should be able to sell the daughter when she is still a minor. The answer is lo, ema af knas b'makom mecher. That means that there is still a knas because the chum still agree. While she's a ketana, she could be sold until she's a nara. So while she's a ketana, both mecher and knas are in place. So our Mishnah does not follow the Rabbanan. Our Mishnah only follows Rabbi Meir's opinion, where one applies, the other one does not. Says the next Mishnah, Kol makom sheyesh miyun ein chalitza. Miyun is the following: when we said that the father has the right to sell his daughter not only as a shifcha, but he can also marry her off. That's what I was talking about before. He can marry her off before when she's a ketana as well. The Chachamim established that if you have let's say the father dies, and so now nobody is there to marry her off, and they find a good shidduch for the girl, the brothers or the mother can midarabanan marry her off. Rabbinically, it works. It's effective. Now, the fact that it's rabbinic means that if she says, I don't want to, then the marriage is canceled. She can back out of it. That's what miyun is. She has the right at any point before she becomes a na'ara, or she becomes right. So then she's entitled to back out of that. That's what miyun is. Then you have a halacha of chalitza. Chalitza is when a person dies without any children, so then his brother marries his wife. So if the girl, who is the wife, is under 12, there's no such thing as chalitza. Chalitza only works, right? Yibum is required, but she can't do chalitza and become separated. Chalitza is only effective once she is a nara, once she's old enough. So therefore, if she is young enough to do miyun, then she's too young to do chalitza. The kol makom sheyesh chalitza, and anytime she gets old enough to do chalitza, so then a miyun, she's too old now to do miyun, right? She can't back out of a marriage that she's been in and been accepting of it. So, Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav, Rabbi Yehuda says in Rav, Zu Divrei Rabbi Meir, again, this is Rabbi Meir's opinion, that these two things don't overlap. The Chachamim disagree. They say, Yesh miyum b'makom chalitza, there is an overlap when there's a situation where you can have miyun and chalitza in the same person in the same time. The Tanya, as we learned in a brayso, ad masai habas mima enes. What is the uppermost age for miyun? Ad shetavi shtei saros, until you get to 2 hairs, which is the na'ara phase. Divrei Meir, it's what Rabbi Meir says, and chalitza starts at na'ara phase. Therefore, the two don't overlap. But Rabbi Yehuda says, ad shir b'shachar al lavan, it's a later phase. It's once she has completely filled in her pubic region with hair. So at that point is later. So there's an overlap because when she's 12, so then she can already get chalitza, but then she can do miyun until beyond that. So therefore, there is an overlapping phase when she could do miyun and chalitza, and so therefore, this Mishnah does not follow Rabbi Meir's view. It does not follow the Chacham's view. It follows Rabbi Meir's view. Okay, last one. Kol makom sheyesh tekiah ein havdalah. In a circumstance where there is blowing a tekiah, they used to before Shabbos and before Yom Tov, they would blow a shofar in order to make sure everybody is aware that Shabbos is coming. So they would blow a tekiah and make sure everybody comes in from the fields. Then they would blow a teruah and tell everybody to close the stores. Then they would blow a tekiah again to say Shabbos is imminent. Then they would blow tekiah shvarm. They would blow tekiah tekiah again to say Shabbos is here. So that was the normal process. But they didn't need to warn everybody to come out of the fields. If you had Yontif on Friday and then Shabbos, then you didn't need to do that. So there's any place that they had tekiah, if you had to blow a tekiah, there was no havdalah, meaning if they blew a tekiah in order to get ready for Shabbos, you would not make havdalah, right? Because you don't make havdalah when you're going from Yom Tov to Shabbos, because you're going up in Kedusha. So, right, when there's going to be a tekiah, so there's no havdalah. B'chol makom sheyesh havdalah ein tekiah. We'll see what that is in the Gemara. Yom Tov shechal yos berev Shabbos. So here's how it works. If Yom Tov falls out on Friday, token, we blow the shofar, veloma, because why? Because you're going to have to stop malacha. Because in Yom Tov you can cook, and Shabbos you can't. So we blow the shofar one time to tell everybody, hey, stop cooking because you got to get ready for Shabbos. But you don't make havdalah because we're not going from Kodesh to Chol. You're going from Kodesh to Kodesh. So you're going from Yom Tov to Shabbos. So there's no havdalah. So if Yom Tov is on Friday, there's no havdalah, but they would blow the shofar. Then Motzei Shabbos, if Yom Tov fell on Sunday, so then Mavdilin, there is havdalah, right? Vatodienu is in Shmon Esrei on Motzei Yom Tov that goes into Shabbos. Right? Velo tokin, but we don't have to blow the shofar now because there's no malacha to warn you to stop doing, because in Shabbos you weren't doing any malacha. Ketzad mavdilin. So, okay, how do you make havdalah in that circumstance? Right? So we make havdalah. Hamavdil ben kodesh la kodesh. You don't make hamavdil la kodesh la kodesh because you're not going from Shabbos to a regular weekday. You're going from Shabbos to Yom Tov. So in that circumstance, we make the special havdalah hamavdil ben kodesh la kodesh. Rav Dosa says, Ben Kodesh Chomer le Kodesh Hakal. That's not what we say. We say, Amavdil Ben Kodesh Chomer to Kodesh Kal. We go from higher levels of Kedusha of Shabbos to lower levels of Kedusha for Yom Tov. Says the Gemara, Hechi Tokeya. So how do they blow the shofar? So Amar Rav Yehuda says, Tokeya Umeiria mitoch tekiya. On these days, when we would go from Friday, when it was Yom Tov into Shabbos, they would blow the shofar and then they would make a trua right in, like without stopping, without a pause. Ravasi Amar Tokei Maria ben Nishima Akas. And Ravasi would say they would blow it with one breath. They would take a second of a break, but they would blow it in one breath. So it was sort of like a different type of a blowing than normal. Askin Rav Asi behutzol kishma aseh. Rav Asi established in the town of Hutzal his version, so that whenever they would have a Friday Yom Tov going into Shabbos, they would blow it in one breath. Meisvei, so we ask the following question. Yom Tov shechal yos berev Shabbos. If Yom Tov falls on a Friday, token v'lo, our Mishnah says we don't blow the shofar, we make a tekiah, but we don't blow a teruah. My love, lo marine call, doesn't that mean we don't blow a teruah at all? You just said we are blowing a teruah in a weird way. But this Mishnah seems to say we don't blow it true at all. So no, that's not what it means. Rabbi Yehuda mitaritz l'tamei, Ravasi mitaritz l'tamei. Rabbi Yehuda and Ravasi will each explain it according to the reason. Rabbi Yehuda mitaritz l'tamei, lo marin bifnei atzma. Rabbi Yehuda says it means that we don't blow it true by itself, right? It's the extended tekiah right into trua, which he says you do. And elam mitoch tekiah, it's right away from tekiah right into trua. And Ravasi mitarts the tamei, and Ravasi says it according to his reasoning, lo marine b'shtei neshimas. We don't make a trua and then a tekiah and then a trua in two breaths. El b'neshima achas. So our Mishnah is not saying that we don't blow it true at all. Our Mishnah is just saying that we don't blow it like normal. Now Motzi Shabbos, practical halacha. So it comes after Shabbos. So heichi amar lo. So where do we say this hamavdu ben kodesh l'kodesh? Right? Because there's two times in Havdalah that it says Hamavdu ben Kodesh Kodesh. In the beginning, right? Baruch Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, Hamavdu ben Kodesh lechol, ben or lechosh ben Yisrael, ben Yisrael amen, ben Yom HaShvi l'Shishim Yemase, Baruch Hashem, Hamavdu ben Kodesh lechol. So it's two times it says Hamavdu ben Kodesh lechol, at the beginning and at the end. So when we say you're supposed to say Hamavdu ben Kodesh Kodesh, which time are we talking about? So Amar Rabbi Yehuda says, B'chasim asa. It's at the closing of the bracha. At the beginning you say Hamavdu ben Kodesh lechol, and at the end you say Hamavdu ben Kodesh lekodesh. V'chein amar Rav Nachman said the same thing, but chasim asa. You only make the change between kodesh and kodesh at the end. For Rav Sheshes, brother Rav Idi, amar af b'psich asa. Rav Sheshes, the son of Idi, said, no, you do it at the beginning also. V'leis hilchos hakavase, but the halach is not like him. And we say amavdu bein kodesh lechol at the beginning, and amavdu bein kodesh lekodesh at the end. Rav Dosa omer bein kodesh chomer lekodesh hakal. Rav Dosa says that we're supposed to say at the end, Bein Kodesh Chomer LeKodesh Hakal, the Leis Hilchos HaKavaseh. The halach is not like him either, right? There's no need to debase Yom Tov and say it's a lesser Kedusha. Just say I'm out doing Kodesh Kodesh. Amar Reb Zera says Yom Tov Shechal Lios Be'emtza Shabbos. Let's say we have a Yom Tov and it falls out in the middle of the week. So Omer Hamavdu Ben Kodesh L'chol. We say Hamavdu ben Kodesh l'chol, ubein or l'choshech, between light and dark, ubein Yisrael lamim, and between the Jews and the non-Jews, ubein Yom HaShvi l'Sheish Ma'amasa, and between Shabbos and the other 6 days of work. Well, my taima. Why are we saying that? We're not separating between Shabbos and the other. This is Yom Tov. It's a Tuesday night. Why am I making Havdalah and mentioning Shabbos? So the answer is, my taima Seder Havdalos hu moneh, because you're just listing a list of things that Hashem has separated. You're not saying this is the thing right now. We're just saying, here's things. Hashem separated light and dark. Hashem separated this thing and that thing. And Hashem separated Shabbos and the days of the week. And therefore, we're making Havdalah. So therefore, it's not, we keep the text of the Havdalah. That probably is the rationale behind the opinion that says that even though we're going to make a bracha, Mavdavin Kodesh, LeKodesh, the Seder of Havdalah remains intact. We're going to say Hashem does separate between Kodesh and Chol. And right now, Baruch Atah Hashem, who is separating between Kodesh and Kodesh. Hadron alach kol shochtin, hadron alach kol shochtin, hadron alach kol shochtin. We will continue tomorrow, Emir Hashem, in person on Daf Chav Zayin Amud Aleph 27a at the top.
Beautiful. Shkoyach, Rabbi Loiterman. Thank you so much. And
Thank you very much, Rabbi Loiterman. We're looking forward to seeing you back in person tomorrow.
Yep.
Thank you.
Have a safe trip back.
Appreciate it.
All right. Just stop the recording.